Over the course of nearly 8 years, FEH has constantly introduced new types of units, skills, and gimmicks that affect the game in some capacity. Sometimes they barely make a splash, sometimes they left a significant impact, or in some cases they completely shift the game for better and for worse. And of those additions, we tend to see remnants of them across a significant amount of the game even to this day. However, when determining which of these updates left the most amount of impact on the game, it becomes a lot harder to conclude as everything that had an impact shaped the game to a significant degree. Some could argue it was recently with the addition of emblems and emblem effects. Others may claim it was a legendary Sigurd since it led to the safety fence, Elamine and Freyr for Aether raids, or Dual Leon for Summoner duels, and so on and so forth. Regardless of what many would argue, I think it becomes a lot easier to navigate through this kind of topic when there's a criteria or checklist of sorts that can properly visualize what makes an update impactful. That type of criteria will most definitely lean on the idea of a new powerful skill and or unit being added that changes the game in some notable way, but one other aspect that is currently being left out is the amount of changes it brings or quantity. Many of these types of banners will ultimately have a brand new busted unit or inheritable that's worth grabbing and may very well last a long time, but never to the degree of it going beyond a single unit, which is why when I think of a banner that reigns as the most influential, I'd want to look beyond what is ultimately the outlier of the batch. Of course, this doesn't mean we haven't had a significant amount of influential additions, but how confidently can you conclude a banner to be the most influential when it may end up being the newest power creep of the week? Is there even a banner that has a staggering amount of new inheritables and busted units, so much so that it left such an impact on the game to the point where it could be considered the most influential FEH banner of all time? In my opinion, there is one banner that fits that criteria. I believe 2021's very own Valentines Banner was the most influential Fire Emblem Heroes banner we've ever gotten, and there's a good chance that we'll never see a banner like that again. Of course, that's mere speculation more than anything conclusive, but when you consider what the banner brought to the game, it becomes a lot harder to quantify potential additions that could change the landscape of the game as much as that banner did. For those unaware, 2021's Valentine's Banner brought us a banner consisting of Henriette, Gustav, Dual Lift, and Alphonse, the first three of which being what changed the game so much. Of the first three units, they were not only significantly strong units in their own right, but also introduced a new type of niche that is still prevalent even to this day. Gustav brought the addition of near save, Henriette brought the addition of far save, and Lift was the first introduction of passive damage reduction shredding as well as fatal smoke. And when put together in a single banner, you end up with arguably the most impactful banner of all time. For brevity's sake, I'll combine the discussion of near save and far save into its own part since they effectively fulfill similar niches. That being said, before the introduction of savior skills themselves, armor units were very much known for being stat sticks that really functioned best in arena and similar modes that relied on BST for scoring. They generally had low threat range and okay-ish combat, and they still kind of fall into that trap, but the big difference between then and now is that they couldn't really fulfill much else beyond leveraging on their stats until the addition of near save and far save that not only leveraged on their BST, but brought about an entire renaissance for the archetype itself. It was a complete game changer. Now being able to protect any ally within 2 spaces with each respective save skill, it brought about a completely new niche and revitalized some units that were once considered bad even after they were given a new personal weapon, and completely changed how people would go in and attack units now. Running a save skill meant that you could force any foe to engage with a specific armor depending on their range. 1 ranged foes were always forced to fight near saves and 2 ranged foes for far saves, so you could effectively force the foe into matchups that were advantageous to the user in most scenarios. For example, one of the most mediocre units at the time, Arden, was effectively a meme unit even after his refund because his stat line wholly focused on his HP attack and defense, while leaving his speed and res to rot, which made him really difficult to use in the grand scheme of things because he couldn't really tank anything that wasn't directly targeting his defense due to his lopsided nature. However, with the addition of near save and far save, that once notable bane became one of his biggest assets since he could force most defense targeting foes to initiate onto him when he had near save equipped, while also being protected by another armor that could deal with the 2 ranged threats that would have otherwise messed with him with far save. And this is without taking into account Henriette and Gustav, who were some of the best in those respective roles. So not only did we get 2 units that were insanely difficult to deal with, but we also got got 2 additional skills that are still used in every facet of the game to this day due to how powerful they are. Of course, it is worth mentioning that the role itself only got better over time with additional skills such as Hardy Fighter, Shield Fighter, Breath of Life 4, so on and so forth, but the foundation is still set with save skills themselves because otherwise they wouldn't be able to function whatsoever. Even if an armored unit is unable to live a single combat, having the ability to protect any unit for their respective range is still invaluable and is something that many people heavily rely on for all types of strategies and game modes. I do think it is worth mentioning, however, that FEH has added several new modes and restrictions to said modes that make it so you can only have one savior skill at a given time. Best example being Summoner Duels. So naturally, the value between near save and far save will vary significantly since there are means to make up for the lack of near save, but not as much for far saves. Even so, both skills, especially far save, can still be seen across most of the game because of how potent they are. Not only for the archetype itself, but also for many to get all types of teams functioning to begin with. Of course, that only covers Gustav and Henriette, and while it's definitely arguable that those two alone make up for the majority of the banner's impact, I would argue that Valentines Lift was his own can of worms that, while not prominent in the slightest anymore, brought about new effects and skills that completely shifted the way people were able to play at the time, and still do. Naturally, the game will shift from nuke meta to tank meta to nuke meta whenever necessary, and Lift was definitely one of the most prominent examples of such. Valentine's Lift was the first introduction of passive damage reduction piercing that we see so much of nowadays from skills and bonuses that naturally give it out, such as Tempo 4s, Resonance, even support like Legendary Camilla, any of those basically. But unlike now where units have a significant amount of other options for tanking, the most units were able to do at the time was rely on damage reduction skills such as Spurn. So when introducing a unit that could cut it down by half, it made it increasingly difficult to enemy phase. This was made easier, funnily enough, with savior skills, but unlike a lot of the other nukes that effectively had no bulk in exchange for damage output, Lift had a significant amount of damage output and a good amount of bulk to boot, which was only further exasperated by his ability to make guaranteed follow-up attacks at a time where no follow-up related effects were extremely uncommon. Because of this, he was very much one of the best Aether Raids defense nukes we had at the time, although if that was all there was to it, I wouldn't have mentioned him to begin with. He was also the first unit to debut with Fatal Smoke 3, which for all intents and purposes is still one of the best tier 3 skills we've ever gotten in FEH, because unlike most other smoke skills, it works without any setup. Fatal Smoke 3 effectively negated any HP recovery skills and effects during and post-combat, which means that even if you could survive Valentine's Lift or even take him out in the enemy phase, there is a very solid chance that you are left with a minuscule amount of bulk to the point where you could just get picked off by the next unit. It is worth noting though that Fatal Smoke 3 itself was not common on most units because of how expensive it was, but because Lift was common and he came with it innately, it effectively reduced some of the best tanks in the game into mediocrity. It did get a bit worse on that front because of the likes of Legendary Sigurd, who also came with it innately, and being extremely common too, so it effectively weeded out a lot of tanks that weren't just saviors for a good while. Although, as a side note, sometimes the skill just has to exist to weed off a lot of characters, although it depends on what exactly the skill is. If something could potentially fail, then it's most likely going to fall in usage, but again, it just ultimately depends on what it is. Definitely not the case here because the most common nukes on Aether Raid's defense at that point in time also had Fatal Smoke, so it didn't really help a lot of tanks on that front. But of course, Lift himself also fell off after a while. But the precedent of passive damage reduction shredding did start as a result that we would eventually see much more of down the line. And it's definitely worth reiterating that what Gustav and Henriette brought to the table was much more impactful in the long term, but even barring the fact that Lift at worst could have just been the latest and greatest nuke, everything encompassing the banner barring the demote was some of the most impactful additions we've ever gotten in FEH, and many of the notable skills and effects that are so commonplace nowadays all started from that banner. And because of this, I am firmly in belief that no other banner comes close to the levels that was 2021's Valentine's Banner. That being said, it's entirely possible that they outdo this banner by introducing new niches and effects that are of similar or stronger potency. But it's hard to say if that that will ever happen to the same extent. We tend to get new types of heroes and gimmicks that change the way we interact with characters now, and we're going to be getting one really soon with the upcoming Reagan banner, but there's no telling what that'll actually bring to the table. Until then, I don't think we'll ever get anything like this again, but whether that's for the best or not is a whole different story, and if you think there was something that was even more influential than this, let me know down below, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.